Made fun of more than a Dyna Wide Glide, nicknamed the girl's bike, yet being the truest to its heritage. Over half a century of models spun from just one bike, the cheapest, most common, lightest, easiest to ride, and did I mention the most reliable? Having roots older than most of you watching, and 52 different models. Yes, we're going to look at every single one of them. Whether you want a cafe racer, a chopper, or even the ultimate stunt riding Harley, this bike is just for you. Nice, this intro wasn't as dramatic as the last ones. But first, hey, my name is Levi. On this channel, we take a look at the brass facts of everything Harley Davidson. So if you're into that, consider pressing that subscribe button and turning on the notification bell so you never miss an upload. This video is going to be split into two parts, this being the first and the last part uploaded later this week. Anyways, people of YouTube, this is going to be a long one, so grab something to snack on, take yourself a seat, and let's dive right into it. Happy New Year, by the way. This is the unmatched, 100% complete history of the Harley Davidson Sportster. The 1950s were an incredible time, at least for the United States. Seeing as how World War II was over by 1945, many soldiers came home and started families. Housing was booming, the whole fast food idea was launched, and it seemed like every industry was on a whole new level of success. I mean, I wasn't alive back then, but it looks to be the case. Also at this time, British imports were becoming very popular. Brands like Triumph, Norton, and BSA. Why am I saying all this? Well, I have to give you some motive behind Harley Davidson. At this point, the Panhead FL was the main bike, and the Hummer was the small option. They were sold with a two-stroke single-cylinder 125cc making nothing more than 3 horsepower. Meanwhile, the Triumph Superbird was making over 11 times that number. This caused Harley to think and create the first small-framed V-twin. The year 1952 would introduce the Model K, big jump for engine numbers. The K model had a flathead design, and that was also a single unit construction. For all the unfamiliar people, this meant that the transmission shared cases with the engine, opposed to your big twin, which is separate from each other. Beyond that, I'm not too sure what else goes into it. It was a pretty nice bike and filled that gap in the market of lightweight cruisers. Keep in mind, back then, even still somewhat now, motorcycles were a luxury item to have. I'm not going to get into the Model K history because I want to make a future video on that, but they only lasted up until 1956. Not a very long run. You may be asking, what replaced it? Or you're not, because it's pretty obvious at this point. The Harley Davidson Sportster. Model name was the XL. A new engine called the Ironhead was thrown into the frame alongside a 4-speed transmission. An overhead valve instead of the flathead design, paired up with 7.5 to 1 compression and a displacement of 54 cubic inches, more commonly known as 883 cc's though. There were 4 cams placed into it, 2 for intake, 2 for exhaust. Pushing out around 50 foot-pounds of torque, it carried the bike down the road pretty good. This is pretty odd by today's standards, but it featured 18-inch wheels both front and back. Stopping power on this 500-pound bike was less than desirable, I will say. Drum brakes were standard for all the 50s models. A 4.4 gallon tank is all you could get this year, and the Linkert carburetor came standard. One thing I thought was cool is that the spark plugs were air-cooled and could be rebuilt. You'll learn something new every day. The classic reverse pedals came standard on these, meaning if you wanted to shift, it was on the right side, and the rear brake was on the left side. Being the birth year of the Sportster, it was reported that a little less than 2,000 were made. The MSRP was $1,103, and today's money, that's about $12,000. 1958 saw 4 new models this year in the Sportster lineup, but first I do have to mention that the Sportster was already being put to the test. Jack Heller was just a normal guy, but took his Sportster to the Bonneville Salt Flats, setting a record that year at 134 miles an hour. Keep in mind, this is 1958. Let's talk about those new models. The XLH had a bump and compression at 9 to 1, running 55 horses opposed to the standard XL's 42. They had optional inch-taller shocks as well as a newly designed 6-volt generator. A model that was sold for off-road use only was the XLC. Knobby tires, smaller gas tank, no lights or gauges, short straight exhaust, and taller suspension. Also, this was the first time that we would see a bobbed fender on the Sportster. Pretty cool little dirt bike. And even cooler was that this was the only year for the XLC model, at least in this exact form. The counterpart, XLCH, was much of the same, with the exception of the higher compression engine with shaved weight. Lastly, for 1958 was the XLR-TT. The same high compression off-road bike, but limited to 26. The TT meant Tourist Trophy, and all models this year got a new countershaft in the transmission with a taller second gear. I'm not going to go over every single little change each year because this would be a 4-hour video. So let's move on to the next. 1959 was not a crazy year for the Sportster. I mean, there was a few things. As I mentioned before, the XLC would not make it past its birth year. On the other hand, the XL and XLH, the high compression model, would have some new features, cutting down to a 4.1 gallon tank, new exhaust, balanced fenders, and a sheet metal headdress, all tied up with a trip meter in the speedometer. This made the bike look fuller, but added some additional weight. The XLH actually received higher lift cams to pair with the bumped compression for a total of 61 horsepower. My twin cam 88 Dyna makes 68 horses. I know it's a totally wrong comparison, but whatever. Though the XLC was scrapped, the XLCH would live on. It kept the 2.2 gallon tank, but was made to be street legal, adding lights, a speedometer, even a horn. It had a really different looking high mount exhaust and the headlight brow that we would see over half a century later. Here are some general things to note about the 59 model year. Harley switched to the Magneto ignition systems for the Sportsters, and more importantly, Honda entered the United States as a very stiff competitor, marketing the opinion that you'll meet the nicest people on a Honda. Man, they really took advantage of the outlaw biker look that was associated with Harley. 1960, HDI, or Harley Davidson International, was established to take a grasp on their overseas market, which became their main focus that year. In terms of racing, this would be the last year that Daytona Beach would hold their motorcycle sprints on sand. Just some fun facts there. In terms of the Sportster, the standard base model XL would not make it to this 1960 production year. The XLH high compression would keep going, but this time with some recalibrated shocks. The dirt bike inspired XLCH would now get a 19-inch front wheel and those same shocks. There was only a couple XLR TTs, the touring track, whatever things. Around 2,765 Sportsters were sold this year, and that was the best we've seen so far. The next year in 61, another small one, only 2 models, the XLH and XLCH. The high compression model would now be getting an even smaller gas tank. I don't think I've asked yet, but comment down below your favorite Sportster model. All that would happen in 62 was the aluminum upper triple trees and different sprockets. Of course, some new colors. At the start of 1963, the XLCH would now get a rubber-mounted steel beam headlight with a dimmer switch on the handlebar, so that's cool. The Magneto would also receive a key lock on the actual unit itself. By 1964, sales did boost up to a little over 3,000, and this was the last year of the 6-volt generator. 1965 saw the first 12-volt system, which has been standard ever since then, even in 2025. Hey, I can say that now. I've heard that Harley just chained 2 6-volt batteries together to create 12-volt system, but I'm not 100% sure on that. The XLH would get a slightly bigger tank at 3.7 gallons, while the XLCH was still rocking 2.2. 1966, if you didn't know, was a very huge year for Harley Davidson. Bringing in the shovel head, that's a whole nother video, but yes, the Sportster would finally see some changes. Sales were at their peak so far with just over 4,000 bikes. New cams were added to both models called the P cams, and they were advertised to get 15% more power for a total of 60 horses. A big leap ahead for the Sportster was 1967. Both models would see a new revised set of shocks, and only the XLH would receive the new electric start, 2 years after the big twin models. But it wasn't until a little company known as AMF would enter the realm, and that changed things forever. Great news, the XLR TT would never be seen again. Bad news, Harley Davidson was facing some tough financial problems. Harley's executives would vote on December 18, 1968 to merge with AMF. Yes, the bowling company. They also make other things, but who's counting? Aside from that, many cool things did happen. 6,000 units sold, and the new M125 Rapido style forks were standard, which added dampening and an extra inch of travel. Over 65 years, the company was family owned. AMF was the first time Harley would see a highly corporate setting. Many were not happy. Great year for sales though, 8,000 Sportsters sold in '69 alone. But first, before we get into the 70s, I just want to mention that these videos take me a long time to make, especially this one, 55 literal hours. I do this for basically pennies, so if you want more of this, hit that subscribe button because we're on the road to 5,000 subs. Let's set a goal for 850 likes, and I actually have something new for you guys. If you want to support me and make my situation a little easier, there is an option to join the channel as a member. Basically, you become a paid monthly subscriber with access to extra benefits and exclusive videos for certain tiers. I'm not saying you have to, but if you would like, get started by pressing the join button below. Anyways, that's enough of the plugging. Let's get into the 1970s. The Big 7-0, the year that changed everything for Harley Davidson racing. But first, let's talk about that ignition. No more magneto. From my sources, it seemed that the XLCH would get a battery for the first time. A little thing called the boat tail was an option for the Sportster, which I had no idea until researching this video. These were really popular on the FX Superglide. Back on the racing topic, there was a little known bike called the XR750. Okay, you've all seen it. Basically, it was a D-stroked Sportster with sources claiming up to 90 horsepower, dual Mikuni carbs, high flow oil pump, and it was super light. Winning first place thanks to racer Mert Lawwill. And yeah, that's where the Harley 1 logo came from. Pretty cool stuff, huh? Back at the Salt Flats, the Sportster engine would power a 16-foot streamliner and crush the record at over 265 miles an hour. Obviously not stock. What a year 1970 was. And hey, I just mentioned the FX Superglide. In 1971, that was the first year. Also, this was the year that Harley would partner up with Evel Knievel, a huge guy in the stunt community, and the first edition of the Easy Rider magazine. The boat tail would also be an option for the final time. And hey, Harley was now in full swing production of snowmobiles. So that's cool, right? 1972, the year that MASH started. What a good show. Mark Brailsford wins the AMA Grand National Championship on an XR750. Let's talk about that. The 750 would receive two models, a dirt track racer and a road race version. From what I'm getting, the road race version was only available in 72. Both would receive ported heads, the new E-cams, 10.5:1 compression, changed to an all aluminum alloy construction. Revving out to 8,000 RPMs, this little machine was claimed around 90 horse, pushing a 325-pound bike. That is insane. The other two models that we've been seeing, the XLH and XLCH, would both receive a new 61-inch iron head or 1,000 cc's. To wrap it all up, they would get a Bendix carburetor. Did I mention the production numbers? 18,000 Sportsters were made in 1972 alone. The 70s were already off to a roaring start, but 1973 would only further the Sportster agenda. The XLH and XLCH kept the 1000cc engine, but had some comforts in mind. A single hydraulic disc brake would be added up front, turn signals were now mandated by the government, and the front end would be swapped out for the cheaper Kayaba forks. They were 35mm made in Japan. Until, of course, that little thing happened. 1974 was the year of the union strike. 101 days it lasted. They wanted better wages and treatment. That's fair enough, right? This would also be the last year Evel Knievel was a business partner because of the failed Snake River jump. Over 22,000 Sportsters were made this year despite the strikes. Impressive. 1975, Showa was now supplying 35mm forks instead of Kayaba. These bikes would also get new petcocks as well as standardizing left side shift. The 200-year anniversary of the United States of America was celebrated with the XLH Liberty and XLCH Liberty. It's just a fancy paint job, nothing too crazy. They were in a very limited run, but the mainline bikes were still being produced. The year of Darth Vader, 1977. Now for the two new models, the XLT 1000 was a light touring bike slapped on the Sportster frame. 3.6 gallon tank, higher gearing, passenger pegs, and a 2-up seat. To top it all off, a windshield and saddlebags. The bags were actually the same ones that came off the FLH. The next model was one designed 100% by Willie G. Davidson, the XLCR, or Cafe Racer. Aluminum wheels stopped with a dual disc front end, bikini fairing, fiberglass tail section, and this all was paired up with a 4-gallon tank. Man, it's a cool looking bike. Even the exhaust is kind of wicked. 78, another anniversary year, but this time for Harley Davidson. To celebrate its 75th birthday, the company would produce a slew of bikes, particularly 7 Sportster models. The XLH 1000, the XLCH were still in the lineup, but the last year for the XLT was 78, making it one of the few bikes with only a 2-year run. All 3 of the models I just mentioned would get some nice upgrades. Dual disc front brakes came standard, Siamese exhaust was added for a different look, the battery and oil tank were moved inboard to clean up the bike a little, and there was only an option to have cast wheels instead of spoke. The XLH would get a special paint scheme of black with gold letters and pinstriping. To match that, gold mag wheels and a nice black leather sewn seat. Fun fact, the tank lettering was actually inspired from the 1917 Harley Model 11. The XLCR, the Cafe Racer thing, would return for this year, and that was it. But just like the XLT, the Cafe Racer would not continue on. Now let's talk about the best bike from 1978, the XLS, more commonly referred to as the Sportster Roadster. Same 75th anniversary paint job, but this time coming with taller suspension, a 2.2 gallon tank, taller bars, and a slick tuck and roll seat. Really nice bike. The best touch is the polished engine. Only 2 were made this year. 79, the Roadster's back, and in massive amounts. 5,123 to be exact. All models would be upgraded with hardened steel disc brakes, even in the rear. A new electronic ignition was standardized for smoother throttle response and overall engine function. Late year Sportsters changed the 18-inch rear wheel to a 16-inch. They got a black master cylinder and an updated style of kickstand. The turn of the decade, 1980, the XLCH was dropped from the lineup after 21 years. Though the XR750 would be made in very limited quantities, the XLH and XLS were the only 2 mainstream models available. New intake valves came along with a newly designed Q camshaft. The XLS would keep much of the same otherwise, but the XLH had a new option called the Hugger package, featuring shorter shocks and a slimmed down seat. But hey, that's all I have here for part 1. Due to this video already being very long, I have to split it up into 2. So stay tuned for the next and final episode of the Harley Davidson Sportster. Remember to leave a like if you haven't already, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button. Big shout out and thank you to sportsterpedia.com for helping me out with some of this information. Comment below what Sportster you own, and let's see which is most popular. Thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Ride safe, and if you can't do that, ride hard.